Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I think everyone's joining in now. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Ideas Research Workshop hosted by the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth at North Dakota State University. For those of you who are new to this workshop, what we do is we invite leading scholars from all over the world to present their research and engage in discussion with the NDSU community on topics relevant to individual and societal flourishing. Our seminar tends to focus on topics specifically related to institutions, trade, entrepreneurship, and innovation, and other topics as well. If you're attending today remotely via Zoom, during the presentation, you will find a link to a Google Doc in the Zoom chat feature. It's in that doc. You can click on that link, and in that doc is where you can go and type up questions that I'll present to our speaker today at the end of his presentation. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can before we close the workshop at 3:30. So with that, we'll get started. It's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Patrick Wolf, who's a distinguished professor of education policy and 21st Century Endowed Chair in School Choice at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. He received his doctorate in political science from Harvard University in 1995 and previously taught at Columbia and Georgetown. Dr. Wolf mainly leads rigorous evaluations of private school choice programs and public charter schools. He's published 5 books, nearly 200 journal articles, book chapters, book reviews, and policy reports on school choice, charters, special education, non-cognitive outcomes of education, and the effectiveness of government organizations. His most recent book is School Choice: Separating Fact from Fiction, published by Routledge, not me, in 2019. Wolf has received 34 grants and research contracts worth $23 million. He's testified before committees on the US Congress 5 times and before various state legislature committees 24 times. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Wolf with us today. And with that introduction, I will turn it over to you, Patrick.
Well, thank you, Clay. I'm delighted to be here presenting to you. I've been following the work of the Challey Institute for the last few years, mainly through the pages of the Wall Street Journal, as your work is getting a lot of deserved attention. So I'm going to talk about 3 of my recent studies of school choice and student outcomes. And I'm going to start with a tale of 2 kids, 2 young boys who met back in 1974 in the 4th grade classroom of Mrs. Silver's in St. Peter's and Paul's School in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Now, the first kid, we'll call him Wolfie, came from a disadvantaged background. He grew up in a single-parent home. His family income was so low that he and his sisters qualified for free lunch. So he had lots of strikes against him. Probably the biggest strike against him was he was a bad skater. And St. Cloud, of course, has a huge hockey culture. And so he ended up sort of growing up a social nerd. Now, the second kid, we'll call him Bits. He came from a very different background. A wonderful, intact family. His father, a pillar of the community, the founder and operator of a very successful business. And also, of course, Bits was forward on the hockey teams, a hockey superstar, all the way through high school. So he had a lot of things going for him. But of course, the big challenge could have been complacency. He might have settled for a career and a life of comfort and ease and not really strive for an ambitious contribution in terms of academia and life. So in a sense, we have Wolfie and Bits, very different backgrounds, but in the same school, a private school chosen by their parents. And the question is, did that choice likely make a difference for them? So what is school choice? Broadly, we can define school choice as any arrangement where parents explicitly select their child's school. This can include private schools, public charter schools, open enrollment, and also what economists call Thibault choice, after the famous economist Charles Thibault. And that's Thibault's insight is that families choose a certain collection of government services, including assigned public schools, when they choose their residence. So a lot of families locate in a particular community explicitly to gain access to the local public school. And so that's school choice too. But really specifically, I'm going to refer to school choice, and most people refer to school choice, as a program that supports access to parentally chosen private schools. So we're talking access to private school choice supported by government resources through vouchers, through tax credit scholarships, or through education savings accounts, which are flexible spending accounts for parents to cover the costs of tuition and other education support services for their child. Currently, there are 56 private school choice programs in 30 states, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, but not North Dakota. So let's look at the map, the school choice map, and you see that west of the Mississippi River, all but 5 US states have one or more private school choice programs. West of the Mississippi, it's more of a mixed bag, but if you look at North Dakota, you see your neighbor to the south, South Dakota, has a private school choice program. In fact, they just enacted a second one, I think yesterday. And your neighbor to the west, Montana, also has a private school choice program. Minnesota is pushing for one this year. If they succeed, North Dakota will be a school choice donut hole up there in the upper Midwest. So why are so many US states adopting private school choice programs? What is the social science theory behind choice? Well, first and foremost, it's a market-based innovation. And it's grounded in the basic idea that consumer choice boosts the effectiveness, efficiency, and responsiveness of service organizations like schools. And it does it through 2 different mechanisms. The first is competitive effects. You know, when you're in a market situation that's more competitive, then organizations have stronger incentives to deliver what consumers want, and to deliver it effectively, and to deliver it at a low cost. So there's the basic sort of institutional competition mechanism for delivering these market-based benefits. And the second mechanism is student-school match. With a public school monopoly, there's sort of one size fits all for students. And we know that different students have different educational needs. And if parents have choices from among a wide variety of distinctive schools, they can better match their child's needs with a school environment that's going to be a good fit for it. So there's this general competitiveness effect or mechanism, and this potential school match mechanism. But it's not just market-based theory that informs school choice. There's also sociological theory behind it, and that is that vulnerable children can gain access to a values-rich environment with positive role models through school choice mechanisms. And these 2 sort of faces of school choice really resonate with what Dr. John Bitson calls economic freedom and meaning. So I think it's no accident that I've been invited to present to you all at the Challey Institute because your theme of economic freedom and meaning really resonates with the concept of private school choice. So what do people say about the effects of school choice? Well, prominent education Professor Christopher Lubinsky and Joel Mallon. Lubinsky is a senior professor at the University of Indiana. They stated in an op-ed about a year ago, 7 of the 9 studies since 2015 found that voucher students saw relative learning losses. Okay, so that's not encouraging. Education historian Diane Ravitch, who is quoted and cited ubiquitously in her attacks on various school reforms, especially school choice, stated in 2016, quote, "There is no evidence that students in voucher schools get higher test scores. No evidence." And finally, distinguished education professor David Berliner, in sworn testimony before the Texas legislature in 1999, stated, quote, "Voucher programs could end up resembling the ethnic cleansing now occurring in Kosovo." Now, many of you probably are too young to remember the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1999 in Kosovo, but it was really quite horrible. And so these 3 distinguished commentators are basically claiming that private school choice results in relative learning losses, or at least no evidence of achievement gains, and runs the risk of ethnic cleansing. So not very enthusiastic about school choice. So my research team set out to conduct 3 studies to test those claims. The first study that I performed in collaboration with 2 former doctoral students, Caitlin Anderson and Danny Shaquille, is a meta-analysis of the test score effects of private school vouchers. And that was recently published in School Effectiveness and School Improvement. The second study is a field study of school vouchers and educational attainment, co-authored with another former doctoral student of mine, Brian Casita, and legendary political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, John Whitty. The third study, published in the Journal of Private Enterprise last year, is a collaboration with another former doctoral student. Yeah, I put out a lot of them. And that's Corey DeAngelis, and that study is Private School Choice and Character. It extends the Milwaukee field study. And we were honored, Corey and I, to receive the Association for Private Enterprise Education Best Paper Award at their conference a couple weeks ago for that paper. So study 1, the meta-analysis of school choice effectiveness, achievement effects. So the motivation for this is that it would be a test of the claim that vouchers do not improve participant test scores. And in the school choice literature, there are some experimental evaluations. These are evaluations that randomly assign a group of willing participants into a treatment group that receives access to private school choice and a control group that does not receive access to private school choice. This is the classic experimental design. And we know that with experimental designs, you get strong internal validity. You have a solid basis for making causal claims about the program you're evaluating being the reason for any differences between treatment and control group averages in outcomes. But experimental evaluations tend to have weak external validity. That is, they tend to take place in particular places regarding particular versions of a program intervention that are in such demand that they're oversubscribed and require random assignment. So you can't necessarily generalize the results from these causal studies to broader populations. That's the weakness of external validity. Now, non-experimental evaluations of school choice tend to have weak internal validity. You can't really be confident that the school choice intervention is the reason for any differences you observe, but they tend to have strong external validity. They tend to take place in realistic circumstances with broad populations of students. So you can generalize easily from them. You just can't be confident you've got the right result too generalized. So our solution is to systematically analyze the results from rigorous experiments. So all of the studies in our meta-analysis are random assignment experiments. But because there are a bunch of them, we gain more external validity in our claims than we would get just from focusing on a single study. So the scope of the meta-analysis, it started with a comprehensive search that yielded over 9,000 potential studies. We then, through a long process of elimination, identified 21 different random assignment studies. And defining a different study was a big challenge of the project because a lot of the research teams, including my own, in this field, produce multiple versions of essentially the same study. And so we just defined a school choice study as a different study if it drew upon unique data, used a unique analytic approach, even on common data, or involved a different research team than the research team that produced an original evaluation. So we included replication studies so long as they were replication studies of other research teams. The 21 studies covered 11 different private school choice programs, 8 of them in the US, so it's pretty US focused, 2 in the country of India, and 1 in the country of Colombia. So a bit of an international flavor to it. Our basic methodology, we started with a classic sort of consolidated grand effect analysis. So we drew the average achievement effect reported from these 21 school voucher studies or school choice studies. I'll use that term interchangeably. And then calculated a standard error for that grand effect. So that's classic meta-analysis. But we went beyond that and used meta-regression because these 21 studies, although it's 21 studies that inform our meta-analysis, they produced 144 distinct findings about the effect of school choice on achievement. And so with meta-regression, you basically use each individual finding as a separate observation in a database. And it's like running ordinary least squares regression. But instead of individual people being observations, the distinct findings that you've gleaned from these reports become those individual observations. And what meta-regression allows you to do is examine heterogeneity in effects. What factors influence how strong the effect of school choice has been on achievement? So our moderator variables for the meta-regression are was the finding an intent to treat finding or a treatment on the treated? Intent to treat, if you're not familiar with experimental evaluation, intent to treat is the mere offer of the treatment, winning a scholarship lottery, whether or not you actually attended a private school with that voucher. Impact on treated is an analysis of the effect of actually attending a private school with a voucher. So those are 2 separate impacts, and we treated them separately in the meta-regression. Reading or math impacts were another moderator variable. Publicly or privately funded programs was another moderator variable. US or international based programs, school choice program or choice plus. Some of these school voucher programs not only included access to private schooling, but had some other educational intervention or health intervention attached to them, like access to healthcare or parent training parents to be more effective in their role as parents. So those were choice plus type of interventions. And then finally, years of treatment. How long has it been since the random assignment? How long has the school choice effect had to accumulate in the outcomes observed by students? So first, let's look at the grand effect results. These are the average impacts of the 11 school choice programs from the 21 studies in the final year of evaluation, last year of evaluation. On average, school choice produced an achievement impact of about 13% of a standard deviation. Now, we estimate the impact using two different methods, mainly methods for determining the standard errors. So random effects is the conventional method. Robust variance estimation goes beyond random effects in accounting for any autocorrelation because of these studies sort of sharing similar data or similar resources. So the robust variance estimation is a bit more conservative in its standard errors than the random effects, but the results are very similar. Robust variance estimation burns a lot of degrees of freedom. So I'm going to focus on the random effects results, and we see 13% as an average achievement effect, and that's positive, a gain of 13% of a standard deviation. Higher for reading, 16% of a standard deviation. A little lower for math, 9.5%. About the same in the US for reading and math, about half or about 5% of a standard deviation for both of them. And then in the international studies, we see some huge effects. Almost half of a standard deviation in reading, which is massive, and 22% of a standard deviation in math, but not statistically significant because there were fewer studies informing those estimates. So those are the grand effects of school choice on achievement, positive gains. In the meta-regression, we look at whether those moderators affect how strong the gains are. And we see with the random effects estimate, there are 3 moderators that make statistically significant associations with how large the achievement gains from school choice are. The first is our PM years of treatment variable. And what that measures is how many years the program was studied across programs. What this is a sort of proxy for a survival effect. Some of the programs might have been so ineffective that they were shut down before, the researchers could follow the kids for 4 or 5 years, or the researchers kind of gave up on evaluating them because the results weren't great. So there is a signal that there's a positive survival effect. The longer a program was studied, the more positive, the larger the positive achievement effects uncovered. Our second years of treatment variable, PCM, actually is a measure of within each study. The longer you follow, you track the achievement effects of school choice, the larger those achievement effects get. So that's confirmation that any achievement effects these programs have accumulate positively over time. They don't fade out, they don't plateau. They continue to gain. And finally, privately funded programs demonstrated larger positive effects than publicly funded. And we think that that's really just a proxy for overregulation by government. Some of the publicly funded programs come with very heavy strings attached by government that likely stifles innovation in the private schools. And we see that the less regulated privately funded programs through tax credits or charitable contributions demonstrate more positive results. So, first conclusion, these gold standard studies, experimental evaluations generally referred to as the gold standard of evaluation. These gold standard studies of school choice collectively indicate that choice increases achievement. Positive achievement effects are modest, ranging from about 5% of a standard deviation to about 16% of a standard deviation. Now, when you compare that, there's been a meta-analysis of every experimental evaluation of every educational intervention from 2001, I think, to 2011. And that meta-analysis found the average effect of any intervention in the education sphere was about 8 to 10% of a standard deviation. So the range of effects we're showing here is very similar to a typical effect of an education intervention, and it's positive. So let's look at study 2, a field study of school choice attainment effects. So Attainment is different from achievement. Attainment is how far you go in the educational project. And it's really driven by character traits, by persistence and aspiration, and conscientiousness. Achievement is how much you know. It's really sort of how much knowledge you can demonstrate on exams, on tests. And it's driven by a combination of intelligence and content exposure. Now, it's possible that different kinds of schools focus more on character traits and less on content exposure, or vice versa. So, you know, with a fixed amount of hours in the day, schools have to choose what they're going to emphasize. And so there could, and in fact, some of my colleagues and I have determined that there is differentiation in the attainment effects versus the achievement effects of school choice interventions. We found that reading impacts, the short-term reading impacts of school choice interventions, only weakly predict the long-term attainment effects of those same interventions. And the math, the short-term math impacts of school choice interventions actually negatively predict the achievement effects. If the early math impacts are positive, the long-term attainment effects are more likely to be neutral or negative. And if the early math impacts are negative, the long-term attainment effects are more likely to be neutral or positive. So it appears there's suggestive evidence that different kinds of schools of choice specialize on either attainment or achievement, and not necessarily both, though we'd like them to accomplish both. So we're going to examine the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program for our field study, the MPCP. It's the first modern school choice program, launched in 1990. Prior to that, the states of Vermont and Maine had provided public funding to private schools since the 1870s. Primarily because they had a lot of rural areas with private schools, but not public schools. And so the government just paid kids to go to the private schools. But the first modern school choice program really sort of focused on school choice as an intervention was in Milwaukee in 1990, so 31 years ago. It's a means-tested tuition voucher program. And it was worth about $6,400 during the period of our evaluation, which was about half of the total resources spent per pupil in Milwaukee Public Schools, or MPS. So here is a graphic. I usually advise against double access graphs, but this one's helpful because it shows both the supply and the demand in the Milwaukee school choice program over most of its 31-year history. The supply line is the blue line, participating schools. The demand line is the yellow line, total MPCP pupil enrollments. And you see that near the beginning of the program, the early years of the program here, it was a very small pilot program, and it was limited to secular private schools. Religious private schools were not allowed to participate in the early years of the Milwaukee voucher program. When they finally were allowed to participate, of course, the supply of private schools for the choice program went up dramatically, and it pulled up the demand over a series of years. The student demand followed in its wake. More recently, there have been more government regulations on the schools, and that has driven some of the schools from the program, but demand for the program from students has steadily increased. So our evaluation methodology, it's not gold standard because we didn't have access to lotteries, but we took a representative sample of over 2,700 MPCP kids, matched them to MPS students, a similar number of MPS students, and we matched them on prior achievement and their neighborhood, as well as these standard background factors, sex, grade, English language learner standards, status, and such, race. And the match on neighborhood was an innovation for matching studies in education policy that later was borne out by several methodological studies that confirmed that matching studies that match on neighborhood closely approximate the results from gold standard random assignment studies. And the reason is people who live in the same neighborhood tend to have other similarities that are hard to measure and control for. They tend to have similar values, similar habits, similar mores, similar aspirations. And so we argue that this matching study is the closest thing to a gold standard study we could do to study the effect of school choice on attainment in Milwaukee. We drew our attainment data from the National Clearinghouse of College Enrollments in 2018, and that database covers 99% of all 2-year and 4-year college enrollments in the country, so virtually comprehensive. So our sample included students in 3rd through 8th grade in our study. We first identified them in 2006 and followed them for 12 years subsequently, and nearly 4,000 students total. The 3rd graders had 2 years post-diploma before we checked the database for their college enrollment status. And the older kids had incrementally more years where they could have entered college and then had a college record. We estimate the 2-year and 4-year college enrollment and completion rates for these students. And here are the enrollment findings. So the darker blue bar is for the school choice students. The lighter blue bar is the carefully matched public school comparison students. And we see in terms of ever enrolling in college, the voucher kids did so at a rate that was 5 percentile points higher. That's 11% higher rate of college enrollment. In terms of 2-year colleges, the rates were statistically similar across the groups. But in terms of 4-year college enrollments, the students in the voucher program enrolled at a rate that was 4 percentage points higher than the comparison students. That's a 15% higher rate of 4-year college enrollment. But of course, enrolling is one thing, getting a degree is another thing. Now, this analysis isn't as well powered because the 3rd and 4th graders in our study didn't have enough years to have graduated from a 4-year college. But for those students who did have enough years under their belt to graduate, they graduated at a significantly higher rate if they participated in the school choice program. 11% received a 4-year college degree, and compared to 8% in the comparison group. That's a 3 percentile difference, which amounts to a 38% greater rate of degree attainment for the voucher kids. Now, when we compare this to 9 other studies of the effect of school choice programs on various measures of educational attainment, high school completion, college enrollment, college completion, it fits pretty closely in with them. The studies highlighted in dark green found positive attainment effects for the entire sample due to the choice program. The ones in light green had null effects overall, but clear positive effects for a key subgroup of students. It was only Matt Chingos' study of the DC voucher program that found no difference in college enrollment. But the benefits in terms of enrollment and degree completion that we found in our Milwaukee study fit in pretty similarly with the emerging literature on school choice and educational attainment. So our second conclusion is 9 of 10 empirical studies find school choice increases educational attainment, how far kids go in their education. And these attainment effects are really about twice as large as the achievement effects. So school choice is showing stronger benefits to children on the attainment side than on the achievement side. Our third study extends the Milwaukee field study by looking at the effect of the program on character outcomes. So for this study, we looked at students in our sample in grades 8 and 9 in 2006, who then would be ages 25 to 28 in 2019. So young adults. There were a total of a little over 2,000 of them. Half of them had experienced the choice program. The other half were their matched peers who were in public schools in Milwaukee. And we used, for our outcome data, we got our outcome data from the crime and paternity suit list of data in the Wisconsin court system circuit court access website. So crazy as it may sound, every time a police officer encounters someone or cites someone in the state of Wisconsin for a traffic violation or any kind of crime, that information goes into a database. And that database is posted publicly and is publicly searchable by the students, by the person's name, by the person's date of birth, and it gives information about the disposition of the charge, whether they were convicted or found innocent, and a bunch of other information. So crime is public in the state of Wisconsin. I mean, if you plan to commit a crime anywhere in the United States and don't want it to be publicized, avoid Wisconsin. It's the only state that prints comprehensive crime information in a publicly searchable database. So that's wonderful for us as researchers, because it allowed me to hire some research assistants, have them search the database for the students in our study. And those students, those research assistants, didn't know if a student was in the school choice treatment group or the comparison group when they were searching for their name. They just recorded if they were in it or not, and what the crime was, and if they were convicted, and those kinds of things. So it was beautiful for our study. And what we treated as outcome variables was any conviction for crime. So we ignored the charges that did not lead to convictions. And also if they were ever a party to a paternity suit, because paternity suits were also in that database. So here's the crime record of our sample. Traffic violations were independent of misdemeanors, which are independent of felonies. And they were the most frequent transgressions in the database. The average student had committed about 3/4 of a traffic violation, but there were some who committed many. In terms of misdemeanors, the average student committed a 1/4 of a misdemeanor, but the maximum for an individual student was 17. Felony, 20% was the mean, 16 was the maximum. And you'll see this is weird data because it has a lot of zeros, it has some ones, and then it goes up from there, because we look at the total count within each category. We decided to use ordinary least squares regression. There are other techniques that might have been a better fit for the data, but they didn't make a difference in the results. So we just use OLS because it's easier to interpret. And I highlight drug crimes, property crimes, and paternity disputes because those are the 3 categories of outcomes where we found statistically significant effects of the private school choice program, of having participated in the private school choice program on those outcomes as young adults. And those effects are actually pretty dramatic. In terms of property damage crimes, experiencing the school choice program reduced your likelihood of committing any property damage crimes by 86%. It reduced the number of drug-related crimes in your record by over half, and it reduced the number of paternity suits in which you'd be named by 38%. So those are large effects off of a small base. But still regarding things that really matter. You don't want these kinds of things on your record. Then we looked at the heterogeneity of these effects. and the effects of the program on reducing property and drug crimes were greater for males than females. That makes sense. Young males commit far more crimes than females. They're greater risk. The program had a greater effect on males. It was greater for students higher in baseline math than students lower in baseline math. We interpret this to be, the smarter students really need the character direction and morals to use their intelligence for good and not for crime. And so we actually saw a bigger effect of access to private schooling on the kids with higher baseline math scores. And therefore, it really had its greatest effects on males with higher baseline math scores in our study. The effects on paternity suits did not vary by sex, and that makes perfect sense, right? Because every paternity suit lists a male and a female. And so since paternity suits are equally distributed across the males and females in our sample, it's not surprising that the school choice program had similar effects in reducing the likelihood of being a party to an out-of-wedlock birth, whether you were a boy or a girl. So our third conclusion is this is the first study of school choice character effects, and it finds that they tend to be neutral to positive, but most clearly positive for smarter males. Overall, the positive effects on reducing drug crimes, property crimes, and paternity suits are about similar in terms of standard deviation magnitude to the achievement effects. So in sum, private school choice represents both a market, that is a value intervention, and a sociological or a values intervention. Choice programs tend to deliver value via improved achievement and attainment. And choice programs tend to promote values via reduced crime and out-of-wedlock births. So what about those two boys? Well, miraculously, both Wolfie and Bitz grew up to become distinguished public policy professors. And you've got to believe that access to private school choice played a role in their success. So for more information, you're free to visit my website and check out many of these studies I've done, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you, Patrick. So we have a bunch of questions in the Google Doc, so I'll just start firing off them to you, so we can get to as many as we can if possible. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question is, does the public as well as perhaps legislative bodies mix up private school voucher models with public school models? Meaning, is it easy to confuse the voucher system for private schools to mean a voucher for all types of school?
Sure. So that's a good question. Importantly, early school voucher initiatives allowed students to take the vouchers to public schools of choice as well as private schools of choice. But so few public schools agreed to participate in those programs that subsequent school choice programs just focused on private schools. In a sense, the private school system itself has alternative choice policies. Public charter schools are public schools of choice, and they're often confused for private schools. A lot of people say that charter schools are private schools. They're not. They're publicly funded. They're overseen by public entities. They're just not directly governed by the public. So there is a lot of confusion about that. But private school choice programs, almost all of them only are available to access private schools, participating private schools, but they often instigate the development and expansion of public school choice programs. So choice begets choice, and tends to generate these communities where parents have a lot more options on the private side and on the public side. And the state of Arizona is the best example of that, where they used to have no school choices. Once they got private school choice programs, the public schools responded with lots of charters, lots of open enrollment, magnet schools and such.
Excellent. So speaking of public schools, we actually have a couple questions. I'm going to try to combine them and not butcher them, asking about the impact, if you've looked at the impact of these the private school programs on the students who remain in public schools. So you could think about it in terms of like competition that might improve public schools, or are there negative impacts? Or so what about the other kids who are left in the public schools?
That's excellent. That's such a vital question in this field. And I've only done a couple of competitive effects studies. I've pretty much left that to economists in our field who have done some excellent studies. There have been 27 careful empirical studies of the competitive effects of private school choice program launches or expansions on the achievement of students who remain in affected public schools. And 25 of those 27 studies find neutral to positive effects. Actually, at least some positive effects of the competitive pressure on student test scores for the students who remain in public schools. One study finds all null effects, so no harm, no foul. And only one study, actually by former graduate students of mine, found some negative effects of one private school choice program, but they were small. All of these effects are small. They're overwhelmingly positive, and they suggest that traditional public schools do respond to competition in constructive ways, but they're so bureaucratized that they move very slowly, like turning a battleship. But that also means that these participant effects of school choice that we find in this meta-analysis are on top of the positive competitive effects that choice is delivering to students in the public schools. So you've got this spillover effect of school choice that raises the performance of the public school students being compared to the voucher students, and the voucher students are still delivering achievement outcomes significantly higher than the comparison students.
Here's, I think, kind of a related question. Is there any research that shows whether school choice increases or decreases the likelihood that a severely underprivileged student will actually attend a high quality private school?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We do see that several measures of disadvantage reduce the likelihood of a student enrolling in a private school of choice if they win a voucher. That includes whether they've been diagnosed with a disability. They are less likely to use a school choice mechanism like a voucher or scholarship. Also, generally, ELL, it's sort of a similar thing, those two markers. But there are other measures of disadvantage that that positively predict enrollment. African American students are more likely to use a voucher if they win it. And also the other factor is males. Males are less likely to use than females, male students. And I think, a lot of that has to do with the inner city private schools that primarily serve kids through these voucher programs and what they're prepared to deal with. Many of them don't have the elaborate facilities and programs necessary to serve the needs of some kids with disabilities. Now, there are some private schools and voucher programs that only serve kids with disabilities, but that's just like a single school focused on kids with disabilities. A lot of the private schools don't have those resources. So that makes it a challenge for kids with disabilities in these urban programs in particular. And the other thing is on males versus females, a lot of these private schools have very strict discipline policies and a carefully ordered environment. And so that can be a challenge for young disadvantaged males in the inner city, and might prevent them from getting access to private schools. So the bottom line is, it's not a zero thing. You know, these private schools do serve kids with disabilities, in some cases kids with severe disabilities. They do serve some kids with behavioral problems and other markers of disadvantage, very low income kids. But the rate at which those kids with really severe disadvantages in their backgrounds use private school choice and persist in it is somewhat lower than the rate for kind of the next group up in terms of disadvantage. So sort of moderately disadvantaged student populations tend to be more successful in getting into quality schools in these programs. The most disadvantaged subgroups don't show as much success in getting into the quality schools in the program. That's pretty much a demographic reality of it. And you know, markets are messy. They don't often work to perfection, and that's an area where school choice as a market mechanism isn't perfect, but it's pretty doggone good.
Okay, so here's a good question. Based on your research, does the data suggest that only a voucher program should be used and public schools should phase out?
Well, we certainly, I mean, that would be a huge leap from our findings. I mean, our results generally show modest positive effects of private school choice programs on student outcomes for the population of students who are attracted to them. So, you know, there are many students, population groups that aren't really attracted to private school choice programs. The public schools work out fine for them. And so I'm just a big supporter of educational pluralism. Lots of different models, district-run public school models, independent public school models, private school models. Let parents choose. Let that school to student matching process take place. In many cases, it's going to involve a parent matching their child to their zone public school. I mean, we did that for one of our students, for one of our children, where we felt the zone public school was a good match for his needs. So I'm certainly not anti-public school at all. I think the evidence suggests options are good, and access to private schooling is particularly helpful for the populations of students who are attracted to it, and it's overwhelmingly racial and ethnic minorities who live in the inner city. They are the subgroups clamoring for private school choice. They're the ones that apply to the programs disproportionate to their occurrence in the population, and it delivers clear benefits for them.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of just following your work, I sort of knew your perspective on that, but I selected that question because I see this a lot. It does seem to be, and maybe you could speak to this. It does seem to be like when I see people advocating for school choice, it seems like the counter assumption is often, well, you're anti-pub, instead of you want more options, it's somehow zero sum. You're anti-public schools. So I was curious, but
yeah, not at all. In fact, I mean, I just did an interview with an organization, the Chalkboard Review, that's a group of public school teachers who advocate for more school choice. So you know, obviously they're not anti-public school. I mean, they work in the public school system, but they want parents to have options.
So we have one question about your motivation. So what led you to go into this research direction in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started out studying government organizations as like a public administration, public management scholar. And I've always kind of fashioned myself a political economist. I mean, I'm familiar sort of with the theory of politics and governance and such, but I quickly adopted econometrics as an analytic tool and sort of the research tools of the economist. I just became interested in the effectiveness of government organizations. And as a quantitative researcher, you're kind of limited in what you can study if you're studying the effectiveness of government organizations. But public schools are ubiquitous. They are the most common government organizations in the country. So I became interested in studying schools. And when I started studying schools, the governance question, school choice, was emerging as a big issue. School voucher programs, public charter schools. And so I started doing school choice research as an offshoot of my interest in public administration and organizational effectiveness. And, you know, it's like catching a tiger by the tail. I mean, once I started doing school choice research, there were so many interesting questions, so many research challenges. And in the end, if we learn that they have positive effects for kids, hey, you know, we can actually help disadvantaged kids, you know, have a better future, you know, like I had. And I feel to some extent, you know, was grounded in the fact that the schools that my mother was able to get me in access to were really excellent schools with wonderful peers.
So one of our participants said that they noticed that Arkansas doesn't have a school choice system. Have you lobbied for one?
So we actually do. So your evidence must have been outdated. I mean, we're red on that map. We're red in a lot of ways, but we're red on that map because when I put it together a few days ago, we had one program. It's a program just for kids with disabilities called the Succeed Scholarship Program. It serves about 650 kids in Arkansas. They can, if they have a diagnosed disability, they can take a voucher to a private school that their parents think will do an effective job serving their education needs. But Wednesday of this week, the Arkansas Legislature enacted its first school choice program targeted to low-income families, which is how most school choice programs are targeted. It passed by 2 votes in the House, in the Arkansas House, so it barely squeaked by, and it will be signed into law by Governor Hutchinson either today or Monday. So we will have our second private school choice program in the state of Arkansas. But yeah, we've actually been pretty slow in enacting programs to add school choice. We're not that much of a school choice state. I did a study. I released a study a couple months ago that's a descriptive study of the degrees of education freedom across the 50 states and their association with scores on the National Assessment of Education Progress. And Arkansas is like 37th in the country in educational freedom. Now that's still better than North Dakota, I'm sorry to say, but we're not a big school choice state. We want to be, we aspire to be, but it's been difficult to get the policy levers in our state oriented toward enacting more school choice. But we had a big breakthrough on Wednesday, so we're celebrating that.
Okay, well, we have one more question. I think we got a couple minutes. We can squeeze it in. So why is crime the best measure of character outcomes? Is there a more positive way to assess this, or one that does not incorporate racial and class-based biases in the police and criminal justice system? So I'm taking that's referring to your third study.
Yeah, so you know, in one sense, we use crime as an outcome because we can, you know, because you know the data were available to us. There are other outcomes, character outcomes you can measure. Most of them rely on individual self-reports. And there's a long and deep social science history on bias in individual level self-reports. I mean, we tend to exaggerate our good qualities and underreport our bad qualities. Like I'll never talk about how bad a skater I am and how bad I am at hockey. So self-reports, they're not consistent over time. They're not as reliable. So they're problematic to use those. Now, attainment is to some extent a measure of cognitive gains, but to a big extent, it's a measure of character too. So, you could say that attainment, I mean, if you want to avoid crime because of its intersection, with issues of race and policing, then look at the attainment results. And those are clear positive effects of private school choice. But I mean, I don't think that the intersection between among crime and race is a problem, generates bias in our study because, we matched our samples based on race. So there are equal numbers of African-American young adults on both sides of the comparison. So we're still seeing a reduction in criminal convictions due to the choice program, and that's irrespective of race.
Yeah, that was actually my first thought as I was reading the question out loud, is you'd have to have a hypothesis or an explanation of how that would be different across your groups in your analysis. But yeah, that makes sense. Well, it's at 3:30, so we're out of time. I wanted to thank you very much for giving us part of your Friday afternoon and sharing your research with us. And hopefully when the pandemic's over and we're back to doing things as normal, we'll be able to invite you out again to talk about some of your new research and other things you're doing next.
I'd love to come back to Fargo. It's been a long time since I've been there.
Well, I'm going to clap, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is clapping for you too. You just won't be able to hear them. So thank you again, Patrick.
Thank you, Clay. This was great fun.
All right.